You finished talking, and while the last word was still in your mouth, you already knew you'd lost. Not the argument itself. You lost because somewhere around the second sentence of explaining, something in you already understood that the more you explained, the less that person seemed willing to believe you, and you kept going anyway. Added a detail, then another, as if the right explanation, the exact phrase, was finally going to make the obvious click into place for someone who'd already decided not to see it. You know the line before you even need it. That's not what I meant. Let me explain it better. It comes out almost on its own, before anyone has actually accused you of anything. Your body takes up a defensive posture before you've even confirmed there's a case against you. And the strange part is, nobody asked yet. You were already defending yourself in advance, as if judgment were inevitable and the only move left was getting there first. The more you talk to be understood, the less understood you become. And no one ever told you why. Maybe you learned early that silence was dangerous, that staying quiet under pressure looked like admitting guilt, that explaining fast, explaining well, explaining everything was the only way to protect yourself before the story got told without you in the room. For years, that strategy seemed to work, until you noticed that the more you talk, the more material you hand to someone who already decided, before hearing a word of it, what they were going to think of you. You know the specific version of this. Someone asks why you did something, and the question already arrives with the tone of a person who isn't asking to understand. They're asking you to account for yourself. You start talking, and somewhere in the middle you realize every word is being filed away. Not to be understood, but to be pulled out later, rearranged, and used against you whenever it's convenient. And the worst part isn't the conversation itself. It's afterward, driving home, or just sitting back down at your own desk, still rewriting the explanation you already gave, thinking about what you should have said instead, rehearsing a defense hours after the verdict already came in. As if there's a perfect sentence out there that would have settled everything. That particular exhaustion has a name, and almost nobody ever learns to name it. At work, it happens almost invisibly. Someone questions a decision in a meeting, and you feel the pull to justify every step of the reasoning, every reason, every data point that got you there. Not because the question demanded that much, because stopping right there felt like giving up ground. So you keep going, and the more you keep going, the more the room learns that you can be pushed like this again. Because you've just shown that you crack open, that you hand over the whole reasoning the moment someone leans on you. A little. At home it takes a different shape. Someone in your family comments on a choice you made, how you're raising your kids, a career mafia financial decision. In that tone that already sounds like a verdict before a single word leaves your mouth. And you go into defense mode. Explain the context. Explain the logic. Explain it again, differently, thinking this time it'll land. And they hear every word of it without moving an inch off the opinion they'd already formed before you opened your mouth. There's a scene you might recognize from one specific family dinner. Someone asks, right in the middle of dessert, why you still haven't done something they think should have happened years ago, gotten married, had a kid, moved, changed careers, and the whole table pauses to hear your answer, like you're sitting an exam you never signed up for. Your whole body braces. The explanation starts, rising before you've even decided whether it's worth giving, and even knowing, somewhere underneath, that nothing you say is going to change that person's mind. You say it anyway. You explain the reasons. Explain the context. Explain it again, in more detail, trying to finally be understood by someone who only wanted to watch you justify yourself in front of everyone else. And when the conversation ends, they change the subject like nothing happened. While you're still there, replaying every sentence, feeling like you lost something you can't quite name, with someone who's only trying to knock you off balance. The pattern is even clearer. That person doesn't ask because they want to understand. They ask because they know you'll answer, and every answer you give becomes a thread they pull later. Ammunition stored away for the next moment they need to put you in a weaker position than theirs. And you keep handing over ammunition telling yourself you're defending yourself. There's something underneath this that rarely gets said with this much clarity. Over-explaining doesn't come from a weak character. It comes from a belief nobody's ever examined closely. The belief that if you can just find the right words, in the right order, with the right tone, the other person will finally agree, will finally see what you see, will stop judging you. And that belief is seductive precisely because sometimes, with some people, in some situations, it actually works, enough to keep you trying it on everyone else. But with someone who already decided what to think of you before they heard a word, no explanation changes the verdict. It just feeds the process. There's a cost to this you might not have named yet. Every time you over-explain, you're saying, without meaning to, that someone else's opinion of you matters more than your own clarity about who you are. You're handing the pen that signs off on your identity to someone who may not even be genuinely interested in knowing you, just interested in being right. And there's a second, quieter layer. People who over-explain train everyone around them to keep demanding it. Every time you justify a small decision, you teach the people around you that your decisions are, by default, up for debate, and that you, by default, will answer for them. That doesn't happen in one conversation. It builds over years of you showing up, every time, with the explanation already loaded, even when nobody had the right to ask for one. Epictetus taught something that sounds simple but is rarely practiced all the way through. He said no one can truly dishonor you unless you yourself agree, internally, that the dishonor is real. The insult only completes itself the moment you step into it, the moment you decide you owe a defense to something that was never yours to carry in the first place. Someone else's judgment only lands on you the instant you accept it as a court with real authority over your life. That changes everything because it shifts the question. It stops being, how do I explain this better? It becomes, does this judgment deserve an answer at all? And most of the judgments you burn energy responding to never earned one. Seneca wrote in his letters about the man who genuinely lives for himself. He said that man needs no audience because he already holds himself to a stricter account than any outside observer could demand. He's already examined his own reasons, already knows why he did what he did, and because of that, he stops chasing approval from people who were never inside the decision to begin with. Someone who needs approval for every choice is never free because they hand over the verdict on their own life every single day to hands that aren't theirs. There's a scene you may have lived without ever naming it this way. You stay silent under a provocation, and the person doing the provoking looks more uncomfortable with your silence than they would have if you'd fired back in anger. Because anger, they know how to work with. Silence gives them nothing to work with at all. Marcus Aurelius wrote, in his private notes, about the strength of someone who does the right thing without needing an audience for it. He compared it to a grapevine, producing its fruit in season and asking for nothing back, needing no recognition, no proof, to anyone that it did what it was supposed to do. It simply is what it is, and moves on. You don't need to prove you did the right thing. You just need to know you did. That's not cold indifference. It's not arrogance dressed up as wisdom. It's understanding that some judgments deserve a response, because they come from people who genuinely matter, who have earned the right to ask, who are building something real with you, and some judgments only exist to draw more material out of you, and they die on the spot the moment you decide not to feed them another sentence. The difference isn't always obvious in the first second, but the body usually knows before the mind catches up. There's a specific tightness, a rush to respond, that shows up when someone's trying to knock you off balance rather than understand you. And there's a different kind of calm, a genuine invitation, when someone asks because they actually want to know. If you watched the video about the people who drain your energy, you'll recognize this mechanism from another angle, because the person who drains you and the person trying to destabilize you are, more often than not, the same person using the same tool. They know your explanation is the thread they'll pull later, and the silence you learned there. The simple act of not handing over everything is the same silence protecting you here. If someone's ever used your own words against you later, You don't need to type out the whole story in the comments. Just leave one word down below. Leave that. There's a specific scene that probably explains this better than any theory why silence works, where explaining fails. 2 people disagree. The first one feels the need to justify every detail, every intention, every bit of context that led to the decision. Talks for 3 straight minutes. The second one listens to all of it without interrupting, then says one short sentence. No defense attached. Got it? Your call. The one who walks out of that room with more power isn't the one who talked more. It's the one who didn't need to. Because over-explaining has an effect that goes unnoticed in the moment but builds over time. Every long explanation carries, hidden inside it, a question you never actually asked out loud, but it's there. Do you agree with me now? And asking that question, Ivan silently hands the other person exactly the power you were trying not to give away. The power to approve or deny your decision. A short answer doesn't carry that hidden question. It doesn't ask for permission. It just states the fact and moves forward. This isn't about becoming someone cold, who answers to no one, who treats everyone at arm's length. It's about recognizing the difference between sharing, because you want to, with people you've chosen, and accounting for yourself, because someone demanded it, to people who never earned that right. The first is intimacy. The second is submission wearing the mask of good manners. You'll notice this the next time you feel the pull to add one more sentence after you've already answered. That extra pull almost always doesn't come from needing to inform anyone of anything. It comes from the discomfort of leaving silence hanging in the air, and learning to sit inside that discomfort without filling it is exactly what turns into presence. Well-placed silence isn't the absence of an answer. It's the most complete answer there is, because it leaves nothing behind for someone to use later. There's a simple practice, nearly invisible to anyone watching from outside, that separates people still over-explaining from people who've learned exactly where to stop. Before adding one more sentence to an answer you've already given, there's a 1-second pause. Inside that second, a quiet, internal question. Does this person actually have the right to know this? Or am I just afraid of the silence that's going to sit there if I stop talking now? Most of the time, the honest answer is the second one, and that's exactly where the extra sentence should stop before it ever leaves your mouth. This takes practice, because the pull to round things off, to tie up every loose end, to leave nothing unexplained, is old. It goes back well before this particular conversation. But every time you hold that extra sentence back and let the silence sit there, something gets a little stronger underneath. Not indifference, certainty, growing more solid each time, that you don't need approval from the other side of the room to know you did the right thing. If you've ever felt the relief of simply not answering a provocation and realizing nothing bad happened because of it, drop one word below. Silence. There's a moment inside almost every draining relationship when silence gets tested harder than at any other point. It's when the other person, unsettled by the lack of explanation, turns up the pressure, asks the same question a different way, implies your silence is disrespect or arrogance or proof you don't have a good enough answer. And that's exactly the moment most people cave and start explaining again, because the discomfort of the pressure feels bigger than the cost of giving in. But caving right there undoes everything the silence had built up until that point. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this too, about watching his own mind before reacting to a repeated provocation. He didn't frame it as some abstract virtue. He framed it as a daily, almost physical exercise of noticing the invitation to react and consciously choosing not to walk through the door. He said most of what we suffer doesn't come from what's done to us, but from the opinion we form about it, and that opinion is always ours to control, even when it doesn't feel that way. Asking the same question a different way doesn't make it more legitimate. It just proves the first answer was already enough, and the other person simply didn't like it. The right response, when the pressure goes up, isn't to explain more. It's to repeat the same position, in the same words, adding nothing new that frustrates anyone trying to pull more material out of you because there's no variation to analyze, contest, or twist against you later. Exact repetition with zero elaboration, is one of the quietest forms of power there is. And almost nobody uses it because at first glance it looks like stubbornness. It isn't stubbornness. It's refusing to play a game that was never about understanding you in the first place. There's one last layer to this, maybe the hardest to accept. Sometimes the person demanding the most explanation from you is someone you genuinely love, a parent, a partner, a grown child, and the desire to make that person understand, to be understood by someone who matters. He's legitimate human and shouldn't be thrown out just because it looks, from a distance, like the same pattern as someone who only wants to knock you off balance. The difference isn't in who's asking, it's in what the question is actually after. When someone asks, in order to understand, silence never has to be total. There's room for real conversation, for give and take, because there's genuine intention on both sides. What this video is naming isn't the end of explaining yourself to people who love you. It's the end of compulsive explaining to people who were never interested in listening in the first place, and only use the question as a tool. Learning the difference between the two is, maybe, the hardest stoic exercise there is, because it requires looking honestly at the other person's real intention, without letting your own fear of disappointing them cloud the read. Seneca said the wise man doesn't live cut off from the world, indifferent to everyone, detached from every relationship. He said the wise man chooses, carefully, who he answers to, and that choice, made with awareness, is what separates freedom from submission dressed up as kindness. You owe nothing to someone who only wants to destabilize you. You owe presence to the people building something real with you. Look at the pattern running through all of this. It isn't about talking less as some kind of principle. It isn't about becoming someone distant, silent, unreachable. It's about recognizing that every word you give to someone who has no real claim on it is power, leaving your hands and landing in someone else's. And that silence, used at the right moment, with the right person, isn't weakness at all. It's the one position nobody can argue with, because there's nothing in it to attack. The person who over-explains gives it all away. The person who chooses silence keeps it. That's not coldness. It's the quietest form of self-respect there is, built on understanding that your peace was never supposed to depend on convincing someone who already decided, before they heard you, what they were going to think. Next time you feel that pull to explain past what's necessary, hold for 1 second before the next sentence. And if this video named something you recognize from the inside, drop just this below. I choose silence. Epictetus wrote that the one who learns to control only what's actually his to control and stops chasing power over what belongs to others will never find anyone able to force him into anything against his will. That's not retreat. It's the only kind of freedom nobody can ever take from you.